This is the first of 3 lectures going over color theory. I'm going to start with this lecture just going over some general ideas and some basic terminology, and we'll go a little deeper from there. One important idea I want to impress upon you from the start is that color is relative. We tend to think of objects having a color, and then that color is sort of inherent and objectively in that object. If you're wearing a green sweatshirt, that green is green. And one thing that happened in the 19th century and beyond was an increasing realization that color was not in the object, but was in the perception of the object. And not only things like the light and the time of day could affect that, but also each person's eyes and brains. So Claude Monet in the late 19th century obsessively painted this cathedral, the Rouen Cathedral, many different ways, many different times of day, in order to show how the color could change. Now he's exaggerating a lot, but what he's doing is noticing how the light itself on the object was creating a different sensation of color. I've shown you all some other color sort of optical illusions here. And so this is a better example of just how this happens in our own brains. Not changing light outside, not changing clouds or anything like that. Just what happens between 2 colors when they're next to one another. Each person's eyes and brains are going to process these colors a little differently. But typically, if you stare at the box on the left for 10 to 20 seconds and keep your eyes there, that rectangular shape here will tend to look a little more purple. Conversely, if you stare at this square on the right, this shape here will look more and more blue. And that's because of just the actual rods and cones in your eyes that receive the color information, and they change. They move around depending on what's around it. So as the orange signal that this is sending starts to fatigue your eyes, like literally, it starts to recede and create the opposite, which would be blue. So the orange background reinforces the blueness of the blue. The green background actually mixes in a reddish hue into the blue, which makes it look more purple. So these are the 3 terms I want you all to really just drill into your head. When we talk about color, even when we use the word color, there are 3 aspects: hue, saturation, and value. We tend to use the word color to describe only the hue. But I want us to start thinking about how hue, saturation, and value are distinct but interrelated aspects of color. Hue just refers to what part of the color spectrum we're looking at. So when we say green or blue or red, we're referring to the hue. Saturation is the intensity, how strong it is. So on the left here, this bright pink is the highest saturation. This is a little less strong in saturation, and this is desaturated. Value is what we've discussed before, going from light to dark. So if we were to look at a color spectrum as a loop, we would get this basic color wheel. And again, this is just a range of hues. There is a shift in value because each hue has a relative value. So pure blue is really dark, pure yellow is really light. But otherwise, what we're looking at here is just the purest, most concentrated, most saturated forms of those hues. If we were to segment this, we would get a standard art education color wheel that maybe you even looked at in kindergarten. So the basic terms here to remember are primary colors, which in this system would be yellow, blue, and red. Those are colors you can't mix from other colors. So I can't start with green and add a little bit of orange and get red. You can't get red except for starting with red. Same thing with blue and yellow. Secondary colors are a combination of two primary colors. So as we all learned in kindergarten, yellow and red make orange. Yellow and blue make green. Blue and red make violet. You may have also been told that you can mix any color you want from these three primary colors, and that is absolute BS. If we were doing this class in person where we'd be mixing paint, you would quickly see that that's not true. But it's a myth that gets tossed around a lot still. There's also division of warm and cool colors. So typically, starting from this yellowish green around to this purplish blue would be cool colors, and then warm colors would be the other side. Again, these are all hues at their most saturated. And I mean, you can't get any more yellow than this yellow. You can't get any more orange than this orange. So there's also color complements which exist across the color wheel. So just as we saw how orange reinforces the blueness of the blue, it's because they're color complements. They reinforce one another. Yellow and violet are complements. This yellowish orange and this violetish blue are color complements. And I'll link to some tools online that show more about how to find color complements. Another significant thing about color complements is just, again, how they reinforce one another in the context of an image. So this painting by Van Gogh is a classic example of the use of complementary colors to reinforce the intensity of each. So there's a really strong saturated blue running through the whole painting, and orange. And that orange feels like sunlight cast across the entire scene, and that blue reinforces that feeling of that warmth of sunlight. Another important part of color complements is that if you were to mix them, again, in a painting system, if you add color complements, they decrease the saturation proportionally to how much is added. So if we look at this red here, this pure primary red, if you add a little bit of green to it, you get this red. This red is still red, but it's less red than this. It's less saturated. Desaturating colors this way produces earthier or brownish colors, although this particular illustration makes it look a little more gray. But if you actually mix them, you get more of this earthy brownish range of colors. Note that if you mix color complements, you actually are mixing some ratio of all three primary colors. So red and green is red and yellow and blue. Orange and blue are blue, yellow, and red. Yellow and violet are yellow, blue, and red. So mixing towards this middle area of earthier, desaturated colors is just some proportion of mixing the three primary colors. In some color systems, this used to be called a tertiary color, and I'm really disappointed that didn't take hold. Tertiary colors, that's a term that refers to something else now, but I wish it were the case because it's very handy to describe this. And the reason is because this is a very crucial aspect of color that will get you beyond painting pretty rainbow palettes. So if you only deal with this color wheel and don't mix in, you just get a bunch of candy colors. But getting earthier colors, you have to mix in color complements. This is another great illustration of this. You can't get this very particular earthy brownish red without mixing across the color wheel, without mixing color complements. So again, this is one more illustration of red and green being mixed together. This green here is still green, but it's a much earthier green. Another way of desaturating color would be to add white or black. So every pure hue has a relative value. Blue in its purest form is really dark, yellow is really light, red is somewhere in the middle, like we've discussed. Adding white to any pure hue will lighten it, obviously. So if you add white to this green, it will get lighter. But you're also desaturating it. And you can see this here. This green here is not only lighter than this green, it's less green. It's less saturated. If you add black and darken it, that will not only darken it, but desaturate it. And you can see this here. Like also, look at the way yellow instantly becomes desaturated. Therefore, if you add gray, you're also desaturating. Although if I were to mix this gray into this green, I would get a green that is desaturated, but the value wouldn't change because these are already the same value. So again, color in terms of saturation and hues interact with value in interesting ways. Lastly, I just want to show you more about saturation. So on the left here, we have these two interior colors are really saturated. They're really bold. They're really close to pure primary colors. So this blue is a pure primary blue. This color here might be, it's probably like a really bold, bright red that has a little bit of white mixed into it to brighten it. But it's, again, very close to its saturation. Then you have a neutral gray background. Notice how this painting on the right has colors that are only less saturated than this. So what is the most saturated color in this? It's this sort of turquoise color. And compared to any color in this turquoise color is really desaturated, relatively. Maybe not really, but it's not anywhere near pure blue the way this blue is. But relative to these colors here, it is the most saturated. So saturation is a good thing to analyze in any image. What is the most saturated point of the image? It's a good question to ask whenever you're looking at an image. Okay, so I want you all to pay attention to hue, value, and saturation, primary, secondary, and tertiary colors, warm and cool, shading and tinting, and color complements, which are colors that are across the color wheel from one another.